Amber flames engulf the Whispering Pine Tavern as 5 outlaws pass a bottle of stolen bourbon between them, their raucous laughter cutting through the night air. They've just made the deadliest mistake of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The quiet man watching from the tree line isn't just another bartender whose livelihood they're burning to ashes. Jackson Reed is the most feared manhunter the frontier has ever known. 12 years tracking the West's most dangerous criminals earned him a name that makes even the most hardened outlaws tremble in their boots: the Drifter. 7 bounties collected. 82 men were buried, not because he had to kill them, but because they were foolish enough to draw against him. Tonight, the Blackwood gang learns why wise men still whisper his name with dread. The flames illuminate his silhouette as he steps from the darkness, weathered, and hovering near the custom Colt strapped to his thigh. 3 days earlier, Jackson Reed wiped down the polished oak bar of the Whispering Pine with practiced precision. His calloused hands moved in the same circular pattern they had for the past 3 years, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through dusty windows, catching the silver streaks in his dark brown hair. Earned more from 12 years of hunting than from his 42 years of life. The tavern was quiet, just old Frank Tillman nursing his daily bourbon in the back corner. His presence was as dependable as sunrise, there every day since Jackson bought the place. Frank never mentioned recognizing him, though the deep scar running along his jawline, left by a knife Jackson had put through his cousin during a bounty collection gone sideways, told Jackson that Frank knew exactly who was pouring his. "A drink's, storm's brewing, Jackson," Frank muttered, eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "Blackwood boys moved into the county. Harrison Ranch burned last week. 2 men gunned down in cold blood." Jackson's hand paused imperceptibly on the bar top. The Blackwood gang. 5 men led by Silas Blackwood, a name with $3,000 in bounties attached to it. Once, that sum would have set his blood racing with anticipation. Now it just made him weary. "Sheriff handling it?" he asked, voice carefully neutral. His right hand hadn't strayed near the Colt, hidden beneath his apron in months. He intended to keep it that way. Frank snorted. "Sheriff Davis couldn't find his ass with both hands and a map. Word is, he's taking Blackwood's money to look the other way." The tavern's swinging doors creaked open, admitting Nathan Powell, the banker's son, young, eager, and completely unaware that the man who poured his beer had once collected a $700 bounty on his uncle. Nathan smiled at Jackson with that same hopeful expression he wore every day. "Afternoon, Mr. Reed. Your usual crowd's mighty thin today." Jackson poured him his usual beer without being asked. "Most folks staying close to home, I expect, given the news." Nathan leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You heard about the Blackwood gang, then? Pa says they're just passing through, says we shouldn't worry." "Your pa's a damn fool," Frank growled from his corner. "Blackwoods don't pass. Go through. They take over. Seen it happen in 2 towns already." Jackson watched Nathan's face fall, saw the fear creep into his eyes. He remembered that look from 100 faces. Good people terrorized by men who thought violence gave them a power. Once, he would have already been checking his rifle, packing provisions, preparing to hunt. But he'd buried that life, buried it along with the last man he'd killed, when he realized he was becoming just another kind of predator. The doors swung open again. This time, the afternoon light silhouetted a figure Jackson hadn't seen in years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a federal marshal's badge catching the sunlight. "It's been a long time, Drifter," Marshal Ethan Calloway said quietly, using a name Jackson had hoped never to hear again. The few patrons in the tavern fell silent. Even Frank Tillman's glass stopped halfway to his lips. "Don't call me that, Jackson," replied, his voice carrying an edge that made Nathan Powell step back instinctively. "What do you want, Ethan?" Calloway approached the bar, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Got a wire from the territorial governor. Blackwood gangs working their way through every town between here and Denver. Burning, killing, taking what they want. He placed a wanted poster on the bar. Silas Blackwood's face sneered up at them. The reward now doubled to $6,000. Governor's authorized me to offer reinstatement, full marshal's authority. We both know you're the only one who can stop them, Jackson. Jackson's fingers traced the grain of his bar, built with money earned from death, trying to create something that brought people together instead of putting them in the ground. I'm retired, he said firmly. Find someone else. Calloway's face hardened. There is no one else, and you know damn well retirement's not an option in our line of work. Not really. He leaned closer, voice dropping. The drifter always catches up to you, Jackson. Jackson turned away, shelving a clean glass with deliberate care. Doors that way, Marshal. Don't let it hit you on the way out. Calloway lingered. For a moment, then left without another word. The silence he left behind felt heavy as a coffin lid. Mr. Reed, Nathan's voice quavered slightly. What did he mean, calling you drifter? Jackson looked at the young man, seeing the same innocence he'd lost so long ago. Some questions are better left unasked, Nathan. Best head home now. It's getting late. As the sun set outside, Jackson watched his few remaining patrons filter out until it was just him and Frank Tillman again, keeping their silent vigil. He touched the Colt hidden beneath his apron, feeling its familiar weight. He had chosen peace, chosen to stop being the shadow that brought death. But as he looked at Blackwood's sneering face on the wanted poster, a cold certainty settled in his gut. Whether he chose it or not, violence was coming. And deep down, in a part of himself he'd tried to bury, he was already calculating sightlines, planning ambush points, remembering the familiar choreography of dealing death. Some legends never die, they just sleep. And Jackson Reed had been sleeping far too long. That night, after the last patron stumbled home, Jackson walked the familiar path to his modest cabin behind the tavern. The cool night breeze carried voices from town. Too many people still awake, too much fear in the air. He'd learned to read a town's mood, like others read weather, and right now Pine Creek was a thunderstorm about to break. In his bedroom, he knelt beside a heavy cedar chest pushed against the wall. The key hung around his neck, untouched for 3 years. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, a Winchester repeating rifle that had claimed more lives than he cared to count, matched Remington revolvers worked smooth by years of use, and a weather-beaten leather duster still bearing. Bullet holes and bloodstains. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Beneath the weapons lay wanted posters, his trophies, though he'd never called them. That, each face on those yellowing papers represented a choice, a moment when he'd decided who deserved to die. The responsibility had weighed heavier with each kill, until he couldn't carry it anymore. A knock at his door startled him from dark memories. He closed the trunk, noting how his hands automatically checked for weapons he no longer carried. Old habits. Clara Wilson stood on his porch, clutching her young daughter's hand. The young widow ran the boarding house down the street, and her eyes were red from crying. They came to the boarding house, Clara said without preamble. Blackwood's men said they're buying my property. Said if I don't sell, accidents happen. Jackson's jaw tightened. Come in. He made coffee while Clara settled into a kitchen chair, her daughter falling asleep against her shoulder. 2 years ago, Jackson had helped Clara escape her abusive husband and found her this new life in Pine Creek. Now another kind of violence threatened to take it all away. How many came? Jackson asked. 3. The one in charge, he had a burn scar. Clara's voice trembled. Running from his right cheek to his ear, Jackson finished. Caleb Nash. Used to ride with the Carter brothers before becoming hired muscle. Clara's eyes widened. You know him? Brought in his partner 3 years back. Jackson didn't mention that bringing in had involved a shootout that left Nash's partner and 2 others dead. He's mean, but he's cautious. Won't move against you without orders. Mr. Reed, Clara clutched her coffee cup. People talk, you know, about who you used to be, what you used to do. People talk too much. They say you were the best, that you never lost a bounty once you took it. Jackson stood, walking to his window. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere out there, violent men were planning to destroy everything he'd built here. Everything good people like Clara had built. That life's behind me, he said quietly. Violence just breeds more violence. I learned that the hard way. And what about when violence comes looking for you? Clara's voice hardened. For all of us? Before Jackson could answer, hoofbeats thundered down the street. Both of them tensed, but it was only Nathan Powell riding past at a gallop, heading for his father's bank. His face was pale with fear, even in the moonlight. They're coming, he shouted as he passed. Blackwood gangs riding in at dawn. Jackson watched Clara's face crumple with fear and saw her clutch her daughter tighter. All across town, lights were coming on as the news spread, fear traveling like wildfire. Go home, he told Clara. Lock your doors. Whatever happens tomorrow, stay inside with your little girl. What are you going to do? Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Jackson's hand drifted to his neck, feeling the key that unlocked his past. I'm going to tend my bar, same as always. But after Clara left, Jackson's steps carried him to the cedar chest again. The leather of his gun belt was still supple, the weight familiar as sin when he strapped it on. The Remingtons slid into their holsters like old friends coming home. In his mirror, a stranger looked back at him. Not the respectable tavern owner of the past 3 years, but the shadow that had haunted the worst men in the territory. The man who could shoot the flame off a lantern at 30 paces and track a fugitive across bare rock. Just in case, he said in his reflection. But the words rang hollow. Deep down, he knew. You could bury the violence, but it always clawed its way back to the surface. He spent the rest of the night cleaning his weapons, muscle memory taking over as he stripped and reassembled each piece. The familiar ritual calmed him, even as it awakened something he'd tried to forget, the cold clarity of a predator preparing to hunt. Dawn would bring violence to Pine Creek. The only question was whether Jackson Reed, reformed tavern keeper, would stand aside and watch his town burn, or whether the drifter would emerge from retirement to remind the Blackwood gang why they should have checked whose tavern they were planning to burn. Dawn painted the hills copper and gold as Jackson opened the Whispering Pine, maintaining his routine despite the tension hanging over Pine Creek. The streets were empty, except for a few nervous townsfolk hurrying about their business, casting fearful glances toward the horizon. Frank Tillman arrived first, as always, but today his rifle rested across his knees rather than leaning in the corner. Ain't your fight, Jackson said, placing his usual bourbon before him. Way I figure it, Frank replied, checking his rifle's action. My cousin would have killed 3 more folks if you hadn't put that knife in him. Reckon I owe you. The Batwing. Doors swung open. Sheriff Davis swaggered in, his tin star polished bright against his dirty vest. 2 deputies flanked him, hands hovering near their guns. Closing early today, Mr. Reed, Davis announced. Town council's orders. Safety concerns. Jackson continued wiping glasses. Town council doesn't own my business, Sheriff. Now see here. Davis's hand dropped to his gun, but froze at the look in Jackson's eyes. For just a moment, the tavern keeper vanished, replaced by something colder, deadlier. That hand moves another inch, Jackson said quietly, and we'll all learn if you're faster than the man who outdrew Quick Draw Wilson. The deputies exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew that story, how Wilson had challenged the drifter, claiming no one could beat him to the draw. They'd buried him the next day. Davis's face reddened. This is your last warning. Blackwood gang's coming and smart folks are staying out of their way. Like you, Sheriff, Frank spoke up. Word is you're mighty smart when it comes to looking the other way for the right price. Watch your mouth, old man, or what? Jackson's voice cut through the tension. You'll arrest him? Finally do your job? That'd be a nice change. Davis's hand trembled near his gun, but he didn't draw. Everyone in the room knew what would happen if he did. Instead, he spat on Jackson's clean floor and stormed out, his deputies scurrying after him. He'll warn them about you, Frank said. After they'd gone, Jackson nodded. Good, maybe they'll be smart enough to ride on by. But he knew better. Men like the Blackwood gang didn't back down, especially not from one man. Their kind of evil festered in the wounds they inflicted on good people, grew stronger with each act of cruelty left unchallenged. The morning wore on. A few regulars drifted in, more to share worried whispers than to drink. Jackson served them, listening to fragments of conversation. 5 riders spotted at Miller's Creek 2 hours out. Gangs grown to a dozen men. Burned the Henderson place at dawn. Nathan Powell burst in around noon, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. Mr. Reed, Pa says they're demanding protection money from all the businesses. Say if we pay, they'll leave us be. Your pa's a banker, Jackson replied. He should know better than to trust bandits. But Mr. Reed, Thomas. She fixed him with a hard stare. Men like Blackwood don't stop taking once you start giving. First, it's money, then it's dignity, then it lives. He leaned closer. You want to know what happens to towns that try to buy peace from predators? Ask Willow Springs, ask Redemption, ask any of the ghost towns that litter this territory. The young man paled. Everyone knew those names, towns that had disappeared into dust and memory after the Blackwood gang passed through. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Jackson felt the familiar stillness settle over him, the calm before violence. He'd felt it 100 times while tracking bounties, that moment when the hunt was almost over and blood was about to flow. Frank Tillman broke the silence. You could ride out. Ain't no shame in it. This town didn't do you any favors, taking your drinks while whispering about your past. Jackson touched the bar's smooth wood, remembering the hours he'd spent refinishing it, the community celebrations it had hosted, the friendships forged across its surface. This is my home, he said simply. Bought and paid for. And some things are worth fighting for. Through the window he spotted riders on the horizon, just specks of dust yet, but growing larger. The Blackwood gang, coming to claim another town for their empire of terror. Jackson Reed, tavern keeper, reformed manhunter, protector of a town that feared him almost as much as they needed him, straightened his apron and touched the hidden, Colt at his hip. The peace he'd built here had been an illusion, but perhaps, he reflected, it had been worth it just to remember what he was fighting for. The Blackwood gang didn't start with guns. They started with smiles. Silas Blackwood himself strode into the Whispering Pine first, all charm and polished leather, 5 men filing in behind him. Scarred faces under wide-brimmed hats, gun belts worn low, eyes that had seen too much killing to ever be clean again. Well now, Blackwood drawled, surveying the nearly empty tavern. Mighty fine establishment you got here, mister. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Those stayed cold, measuring everything they saw. Heard you're the owner. Jackson kept wiping. Glasses, his movements unhurried. That's right. Only Frank Tillman remained at his corner table, rifle still across his knees. The rest of the customers had melted away when the gang rode in. Blackwood pulled out a chair, the scrape against wooden floors loud in the silence. His men spread out casually, hands never far from their guns. See? Me and my associates, we're businessmen looking to invest in local establishments, provide protection, you might say. Don't need protection, Jackson replied. Blackwood's smile tightened. Oh, but you do. Dangerous times. Why, just last week, 3 businesses burned down in Willow Springs. Tragic accidents. He pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. Small weekly payment guarantees nothing, unfortunately. Happens here. Jackson set down his glass. That a threat? Business proposition. Blackwood leaned forward. Smart folks take it. Others, he shrugged. Well, accidents happen. Like Clara Wilson's husband. Jackson's voice carried an edge. That accident where you beat a man to death for refusing to sell his land. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Blackwood's men tensed, hands drifting closer to weapons. You seem well informed, Mr. Reed. She met his gaze steadily. Jackson Reed. Recognition flickered in Blackwood's eyes. The smile vanished. The drifter. His hand moved fast as a snake, but Jackson was faster. His hidden Colt appeared, hammer, cocked before Blackwood could clear leather. That would be a mistake, Jackson said quietly. Blackwood forced a laugh, hands raising slightly. Now, boys, it seems we've stumbled into quite a situation. The famous drifter running a tavern. His eyes narrowed. Heard you'd gone soft, religious maybe, found peace. Peace was a choice, Jackson replied. One you're making is really hard to keep. Way I see it, Blackwood stood slowly. You got two choices. Take our offer, live quietly, or we burn this place down with you in it. The gang members spread wider, cutting off angles. 6 against 1, not counting Frank Tillman. Bad odds, even for him. Third choice, Jackson suggested. You ride out, find easier prey. Blackwood's laugh turned ugly. You think I'm afraid of Summers being manhunter? Times have changed, Drifter. The West's getting civilized. Law's in our pocket now. You're just a relic. He turned to leave. Then, him paused. You got 1 hour. Smart money says you run. After they left, Frank spoke up. They'll be back with more men. Jackson nodded. Get Clara Wilson and the others to safety. Church basement, maybe. And you? She was already moving toward her back room. Got some things to take care of. In his bedroom, Jackson opened the cedar chest. The leather duster settled on his shoulders like old sin, heavy with memory and gunsmoke. Matched Remingtons rode his hips now, the Winchester cradled in practiced hands. When he emerged, the man who had served drinks and sought peace was gone. The drifter walked in his boots, eyes sharp as razor wire, moving liquid with deadly grace. Exactly 58 minutes later, the Blackwood gang returned, 12 men this time, spreading out to surround the tavern. Blackwood's voice carried on. The wind, burn it! Oil splashed against wooden walls. Torches arced through the air. The whispering pine, Jackson's attempt at a peaceful life, began to burn. Inside, Jackson Reed checked his weapons one last time. Peace had been nice while it lasted, but some people only understood one language. Time to remind them why they used to whisper his name in fear. Flames licked the Whispering Pines walls as Jackson moved through smoke like a ghost. The gang expected him to either flee or die. Instead, he used their own fire as cover. The first outlaw died without a sound. Jackson's knife found his throat as he reloaded his torch, his body crumpling in the shadows behind the tavern. The second managed half a scream before a Remington bullet silenced him. By then, it was too late for warnings. Find him, Blackwood's voice carried over the crackling flames. $1,000 to the man who brings me his head. Jackson allowed himself a cold smile. $1,000. That's what his life was worth to them. He'd collected bigger bounties on horse thieves. Through the smoke, he counted 10 men still standing, spreading out in pairs to search. Amateur mistake. He'd hunted men like this across 3 territories. Rule 1. Never split your forces against a superior opponent. A bullet whizzed past his head. One of Blackwood's men had spotted his shadow against the flames. He dropped and rolled, coming up. Behind a water trough, as return fire splintered wood around him. Got him pinned, someone shouted. By the trough. Jackson's Winchester spoke 3 times. 3 men fell. No wasted shots, no hesitation. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was survival. Jesus Christ! The cry came from Caleb Nash, the scarred enforcer. That's 5 men down in 2 minutes. Blackwood's response was drowned by gunfire as his remaining men opened up on Jackson's position, but he was already moving, using techniques learned from 12 years of manhunting. Stay mobile, use a cover, let them waste ammunition. "Boss!" One of the gang members pointed toward town. "Riders coming!" Jackson heard hoofbeats approaching. For a moment, he feared Blackwood had more men in reserve. Then he recognized Frank Tillman's voice bellowing like a bull. "Deputies, spread out!" At least 6 horses thundered in from the darkness. Guns blazed, but no bullets flew. Frank had organized the townsmen, using the dark and noise to seem like a larger force. Blackwood's men broke formation, confused by the new threat. Jackson used their distraction to deadly effect. 2 more fell before they realized their mistake. Dyke, remaining outlaws scrambled for their horses. "Regroup at Coyote Ridge," Blackwood shouted, wheeling his horse around. "This ain't over, Drifter." Jackson emerged from cover, Winchester raised. One shot could end Blackwood right there, but experience stayed his hand. Wounded predators were the most dangerous. Better to let him run than hunt him properly. As the gang fled into darkness, Jackson surveyed the damage. His tavern was still burning, though the flames hadn't reached the load-bearing walls yet. 5 of Blackwood's men lay dead or dying. No casualties on his side. Frank Tillman rode up, leading a string of horses behind him. Jackson recognized Nathan Powell, Clara Wilson's brother, and other townsfolk he'd served drinks to just hours ago. All armed, all looking at him with mixed fear and awe. "Couldn't let you face them alone," Frank said gruffly. "Gathered everyone who could shoot straight." Jackson nodded, touched by their courage, even as he calculated how to use it. "Blackwood will be back, stronger next time. Then we'll be ready," Nathan declared, trying to sound braver than he looked. "Right, Mr. Reed?" Jackson studied these people, shopkeepers, farmers, ordinary folks ready to fight. They deserved better than false hope. "No," he said finally. "You won't be. Not for what's coming. Blackwood's pride won't let this stand. He'll bring real killers next time, men who know their business." "Then what do we do?" Clara's brother asked. Jackson checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. "You get your families somewhere safe. I did what I should have done when they first rode in." "Which is?" Her voice carried the cold certainty that had made him legend. "I hunt them down, every last one." As if to emphasize his words, part of the Whispering Pines roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Jackson watched his attempt at a peaceful life burn away, replaced by the familiar clarity of the hunt. "Frank, I need information. Blackwood gang's usual haunts, known associates, any property they might use as hideouts." "I'll ask around." Frank nodded. "Still got friends in low places. Nathan, your pa's bank records might show unusual transactions. Protection money leaves a trail." The young man straightened. "I'll check first thing tomorrow." Jackson strapped on his gun belt, adjusting the weight of the Remingtons. The familiar routine brought back memories of 100 other hunts. But this one was different. This wasn't about bounties anymore. "Mr. Reed," Nathan's voice quavered slightly, "the stories about you, about the Drifter, are they true?" She looked at him, remembering the naive young man who'd brought Clara wildflowers last spring. His innocence seemed a lifetime ago. "The sea stories?" A shell casing crunched under his boot as he walked past Nathan. "They didn't tell me half of it." By dawn, Jackson's tavern was a smoldering ruin, but his mind was razor-sharp. He stood in his back room, spreading a weathered map across a table. 12 years of manhunting had taught him to memorize every cave, canyon, and abandoned mine in the territory. Now those mental notes became marks on paper, possible hiding spots circled in ink. Frank Tillman entered, bringing trail dust and information. "Talked to some folks in the shadow business. Blackwood's got a camp up in Devil's Backbone. 15, maybe 20 men." Jackson marked the location. "Armed? Like an army. Word is they've been stockpiling Henry rifles, dynamite, even a Gatling gun, preparing for war." Territory's getting civilized, Jackson mused. Men like Blackwood know their time's running out. There's more. Frank hesitated. Caleb Nash has been asking questions about you. About what happened in Deadwood. Jackson's hand stilled on the map. Deadwood, where he'd earned his reputation and his nightmares. What do they know? Just rumors that you took down the entire Malone brothers gang single-handed, that you tracked Nash's partner for 10 days across dead ground before putting him in the ground. A knock interrupted them. Nathan Powell entered carrying bank ledgers, his young face pale with lack of sleep. "Found something," he said, spreading papers beside Jackson's map. "Pa's been recording payments to a mining company that doesn't exist. Coyote Ridge Exploration." Jackson traced the connection. Coyote Ridge, where Blackwood ordered his men to regroup. There's more. Nathan pointed to various entries. Similar payments from every business in 3 towns, all filtered through. Dummy companies, all leading back to Blackwood. He's building an empire, using fear and corruption instead of bullets, Frank growled. Smart. Law can't touch him if everything looks legal on paper, Jackson admitted. Mr. Reed, Nathan's voice cracked slightly, what he did to your tavern. Why didn't you just pay? Would have been cheaper than rebuilding. Jackson checked his Winchester's action, the metallic click sharp in the quiet room. Because some things cost more than money, Nathan. Every dollar paid to men like Blackwood becomes a bullet in someone else's child. Every compromise feeds their power. He rolled up the map decision. Frank, I need you to send telegrams. Call in some markers. What kind of markers? The kind that owe the drifter their lives or their freedom. Jackson strapped on his gun belt. Nathan followed him outside. Those ledgers are evidence, Jackson told him. Get them somewhere safe. The morning sun painted the desert gold as Jackson mounted his horse, the familiar weight of weapons and leather settling around him. He'd spent 3 years trying to forget what he was. Now he embraced it. Where are you heading? Frank called. After him. Deadwood, Jackson replied. Got an old friend there who specializes in the kind of equipment we'll need. Will you? Thomas stepped forward. You're coming back then? Jackson turned in his saddle, studying the town he'd tried to call home. Good people lived in fear because men like Blackwood thought violence made them kings. Oh, I'm coming back, he said softly, and I'm bringing hell with me. 3 days later, Silas Blackwood paced in his camp at Devil's Backbone, rage burning. In his gut, 5 men dead, 5, and not in a fair fight, but picked off like rabbits by a man they'd thought gone soft. Boss! Caleb Nash burst into the tent. Riders coming in from Deadwood, you need to hear this. The messenger, dust-covered and wild-eyed, babbled his news. Jackson Reed had been spotted, but he wasn't alone. 3 men rode with him, killers whose names made even Blackwood's blood run cold. Samuel Deadeye Carson, the sniper who could hit a playing card at 500 yards. William Hangman Hughes, former executioner turned bounty hunter. And worst of all, Miguel Ghost Ramirez, the Comanche-raised tracker who'd learned hunting from his tribe before turning those skills to manhunting. He's calling in his markers, Nash whispered. Every killer and tracker who ever owed the drifter a favor. He's one man with a handful of has-been gunfighters, Blackwood roared. But his voice lacked conviction. Boss. Nash's voice shook slightly. You don't understand. These aren't just killers. These are legends, men who... I don't care if they're the 4 horsemen themselves. Blackwood hurled his whiskey glass against the tent wall. I won't let some tavern keeper destroy everything we've built. Send word to all our holdings. I want every gunman on our payroll here within the week, and double the bounty on Reed's head. But that night, as Blackwood lay sleepless in his tent, doubt gnawed at him. He'd thought the drifter was just another story, a legend built more on reputation than fact. Now he wondered if he'd awakened something better left sleeping. In the darkness outside his tent, a sentry's cry was cut suddenly short. By the time Blackwood grabbed his gun, 2 more guards had vanished silently into the night. The hunt had begun, and Jackson Reed was teaching them, one death at a time, why wise men still whispered his name in fear. Dawn broke over Devil's Backbone, revealing 3 more of Blackwood's men hanging from a cliff edge. Each had a wooden token pinned to his chest, a carved drifting feather, the drifter's calling card. Blackwood's remaining men crossed themselves, whispering about ghosts and vengeance. But Jackson Reed wasn't interested in vengeance. This was strategy, each death carefully staged to spread fear, each victim chosen to demonstrate there was nowhere Blackwood's men could hide. Psychological warfare. Just like Deadwood, Carson commented, watching through his rifle scope as Blackwood's men cut down their comrades. Jackson cleaned his Remingtons with practiced care. Fear kills more surely than bullets. Blackwood built his empire on it. He learned how it feels. They'd made camp in a hidden box canyon 2 miles from Blackwood's position. Ramirez had found it using tracking skills that seemed more magic than science. The Comanche-trained scout materialized from the shadows now, moving silent as smoke. Blackwood sent riders to all his holdings, he reported, calling in every gunman on his payroll, offering $5,000 for your head now. Price keeps going up, Hughes grinned, checking the rope coils on his saddle. Making us famous, Jackson. Fame's worthless, Jackson replied. Information's what we need. Ramirez nodded. Found their supply cache. Ammunition, dynamite, enough weapons to arm 50 men. They're preparing for war. War implies both sides shooting, Carson said coldly. This is more like watching a wolf hunt sheep. Jackson spread his map, marking positions. 3 days of carefully planned strikes had reduced Blackwood's force by a quarter, but reinforcements would arrive soon, and the element of surprise wouldn't last forever. Frank's message came in, Hughes announced, holding up a telegram. Town's organizing, even got the sheriff locked up. Seems some interesting documents appeared, proving his connection to Blackwood's operation. Jackson allowed himself a small smile. Nathan Powell's bank ledgers had proved more deadly than bullets. A horse approached their camp, the specific rhythm of hoofbeats identifying Frank Tillman himself. He'd been coordinating between Jackson's hunters and the townsfolk, keeping information flowing. Blackwood's getting desperate, he reported, dismounting. Sent men to threaten Clara Wilson and her daughter. Trying to draw you out. Jackson's expression hardened. Clara safe. Got her and the child hidden in the old mission. Nathan Powell organizing other families to protect them. Blackwood's showing his hand, Ramirez observed. Desperate men make mistakes or become more dangerous, Jackson countered. How many gunmen are coming? At least 25, Frank said. Some real ugly customers. Killers from down Mexico way, hunters from up north. Men who've heard of the drifter and want to make their reputation by taking you down. Jackson checked his ammunition. They'll die just the same. Jackson, Frank hesitated. Town's talking about Deadwood, about what really happened there. The hunters went quiet. Deadwood was a wound none of them liked to prod. Deadwood's past, Jackson said flatly. This is now. But later, alone in his tent, he pulled out the newspaper clipping he always carried, yellow with age. It told of the Malone brothers' last stand, 41 men dead in a single night. The official story said a combined force of lawmen had done it. The truth was darker. One man moving like a shadow through the night, dealing death with mechanical precision. Not for justice, not for bounty, but because some men needed killing, and he'd learned to be very, very good at it. A commotion outside broke his dark memories. Ramirez had captured one of Blackwood's scouts, a young man barely 20, shaking with terror. Please, he stammered as Jackson approached. Blackwood sent me, said to deliver a message. Speak. He says meet him, noon tomorrow. Main Street of Pine Creek, just you and him. End this properly. Jackson studied the boy. And if I refuse? Says he'll burn every building in town, kill every person who helped you. Says he'll make it slow. The hunters exchanged glances. It was an obvious trap. "Let him go," Jackson ordered. "You're not considering his offer?" Hughes demanded once the scout had fled. "Course he is," Carson said quietly, "because that's what the drifter does, uses the enemy's traps against them." Jackson checked his weapons one final time. "Gather everyone. Time to remind Blackwood why smart men don't make demands of legends." Night fell over the desert, both sides prepared. Blackwood fortified the town, positioning gunmen in windows and on rooftops. Jackson's hunters moved like ghosts through the darkness, setting their own pieces on the board. Tomorrow would end it, one way or another. Jackson watched the stars wheel overhead, remembering another night before another battle. Deadwood had made him a legend. Pine Creek would either cement that legend or end it. Either way, there would be no more running from what he was, no more pretending at peace. Some people were born to violence, not because they loved it, but because they were damn good at it. And Jackson Reed was the best there had ever been. Pine Creek lay silent as a grave at dawn. Blackwood's men had cleared the streets, forcing townsfolk into their homes at gunpoint. Sharpshooters lurked on rooftops, rifles glinting in the early light. The stage was set for slaughter. Jackson watched through Carson's spyglass from their hidden position. "Count 40 shooters visible," the sniper reported. "More inside the buildings." "They're expecting us to hit hard from the outskirts," Jackson noted. Classic siege tactics. Ramirez materialized from the shadows, found signs of dynamite rigged under the main street. "They plan to blast us if we bunch up." Jackson handed back the spyglass. "Good." Hughes raised an eyebrow. "Good?" "Means they're thinking like soldiers," Jackson explained. "Preparing for an army, not a shadow." Frank Tillman rode up, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Jackson, got word from town. Blackwood's got Clara Wilson." The temperature seemed to drop. Jackson's voice turned deadly quiet. "Where?" "Hotel. Top floor. Using her and the little girl as shields." The other hunters watched their leader carefully. They'd seen that look before, in Deadwood, right before the killing started. "Change of plans," Jackson said. "Ramirez, get me into town. Rest of you, be ready." "Jackson," Carson warned, "you go in alone. It's suicide." "Only if they see me coming." Ramirez led him through hidden paths even Blackwood's scouts hadn't found. They passed 3 sentries who would never report again, the Comanche's knife ensuring their silence. At the hotel's back door, Jackson paused. "Remember Deadwood," he told Ramirez. "When I signal, hit them hard. Make them look the wrong way." Inside, Jackson moved like smoke through empty corridors. 2 of Blackwood's men guarded the stairs. Both died without a sound, his blade precise. He could hear Clara's daughter crying above. 3rd floor. 4 more guards. Jackson's first shot took the nearest in the throat. Before his body hit the floor, Jackson was moving. 2nd guard reached for his gun, too slow. 3rd managed to fire, the bullet passing through the space Jackson had already left. 4th died reaching for a whistle. Blackwood's voice carried through the door. "Hear that, Mrs. Wilson? That's what mercy sounds like, dying." Jackson kicked the door open. Blackwood held Clara in front of him, gun to her head. 3 more men had rifles trained on her daughter in her cradle. "Should have stayed retired, drifter," Blackwood sneered. "Now drop those guns, or—" Jackson's hands moved faster than thought. First shot took Blackwood's ear off. 2nd, 3rd, and 4th dropped his men before they could blink. 5th bullet knocked Blackwood's gun away as he screamed, clutching his bloody head. Clara grabbed her daughter and ran. Jackson advanced on Blackwood, who scrambled back against the wall. "Wait, I got money, connections, we can—" "Quiet!" Jackson's voice could have frozen hell. "Ramirez now!" Explosions rocked the town. Carson's rifle began its deadly song. Blackwood's carefully planned defense dissolved into chaos as Jackson's hunters struck from multiple directions. "Your men are dying," Jackson told Blackwood. "Again." "Just like Deadwood." Blackwood's eyes widened in recognition. "It really was you." 41 men, Jackson answered. 42, counting their leader. You're going to die tonight, Silas. Only question is how many of your friends I take with you. Jackson, Frank's voice carried from outside the hotel. Blackwood's reinforcements are coming. 20 riders from the north. Jackson smiled coldly as Blackwood cowered against the wall. Hear that? More men are riding to die for you. His finger tightened on the trigger. But first, I need you to understand something. Please, Blackwood begged. I'll leave, never come back. Too late for that. Jackson's voice dropped to a whisper. See, you made 3 mistakes. First, you thought I was retired. Second, you burned my tavern. And the third? Blackwood's voice trembled. Your biggest mistake. Jackson's eyes narrowed to slits. You threatened a mother and her child. That's what the Malone brothers did in Deadwood. Killed a family just to prove they could. Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes, followed by pure terror. Wait. The gunshot echoed across Pine Creek. 1. More body for the desert to claim. But Jackson was already moving. The real battle was just beginning, and he had more lessons to teach about why some legends are best left alone. Pine Creek erupted into war. Blackwood's reinforcements thundered into town, rifles blazing, only to find themselves riding into a carefully laid trap. Carson's precise shots dropped leaders from their saddles. Hughes had rigged buildings with explosive surprises. Ramirez's carefully placed mirrors blinded riders at crucial moments. But it was Jackson who truly terrified them. He seemed to materialize from thin air, dealing death with mechanical precision. 3 riders turned a corner to find him waiting. All 3 died before they could level their weapons. 4 more tried to flush him from a building, only to realize. Too late, they were the ones trapped. Like watching a wolf hunt, Frank muttered from his position. Not a wolf, Ramirez corrected, appearing beside him. Wolves hunt in packs. He hunts like a mountain lion, alone, patient, deadly. A rider spotted them wheeling his horse around. Frank raised his rifle, but Ramirez's thrown knife found the man's throat first. Speaking of deadly, Frank commented, Jackson saved my life in Deadwood, Ramirez explained, retrieving his knife. I was tracking the Malone brothers. Got careless. They caught me, started cutting pieces off. His face darkened at the memory. He appeared like a spirit of vengeance. Killed 12 men in the time it takes to draw breath. Never seen anything like it. Why did you come when he called? Partly. Ramirez vanished as more riders approached. Frank heard screams, then silence. The Comanche-trained scout reappeared, wiping his blade. But also because he hunts evil men, not for money, not for fame, but because someone has to. Across town, Jackson moved through smoke and chaos like a ghost. Blackwood's men were well-armed, well-trained, and utterly unprepared for what they faced. They were used to bullying townsfolk, not fighting someone who had turned violence into an art form. Boss is dead. The cry spread through their ranks. Blackwood's dead. Some tried to flee. Others, the real killers, turned more vicious. A group of them cornered Nathan Powell, who'd been helping evacuate families. They meant to make an example of him. Let him go. Jackson's voice cut through the gun smoke. 5 hardened killers turned to find him standing in the street. Remingtons, gleaming. They knew his reputation, knew what he'd done to Blackwood, but they were killers themselves. Proud and 5-on-1 seemed like good odds. Their leader sneered, even for the drifter. Those odds. His first shot took him in the heart. Second and third dropped the men flanking him. Fourth caught another drawing his gun. The last man managed to fire and missed as Jackson seemed to flow around the bullet. His final shot ended the man. Nathan stared at the 5 bodies, then at Jackson. How do you move like that? Practice, Jackson said simply. Get to the church. Help Clara Wilson with the wounded. But as he turned away, a voice from his past froze him in place. Still quick as ever, little brother. Jackson's blood ran cold. Standing in the smoke was a man he'd hoped never to see again. Tall, scarred, with eyes as dead as desert stones. Matthew. Reed. Jackson's guns remained steady, though his heart raced. Thought you were still in prison. Got out early. Good behavior. His smile was a snake smile. Heard my brother had gone respectable. Running a tavern of all things. Had to see. For myself. You're working for Blackwood? Matthew shrugged. Was. Man's dead now, but this... He gestured at the chaos around them. This is the brother I remember. The one I trained. The one who turned out to be better at killing than his own teacher. I'm nothing like you. No? He moved closer, every step calculated, predatory. Tell that to the men you've killed. Tell that to the families of the Malone brothers. 41 men in one night. That's not justice, brother. That's talent. Jackson's jaw tightened. They killed innocent people. And you've killed guilty ones, but killing is killing. Blood is blood. His hands drifted toward his guns. Remember what I taught you. Only two kinds of killers in this world, the quick and the dead. The air seemed to crystallize between them. Two legends, two killers, teacher and student, brother and brother. Walk away, Matthew, Jackson warned. I won't tell you twice. Matthew's laugh was old as a grave. Can't do that, brother. See, Blackwood wasn't just paying me money. He promised me something better, a chance to remind the world that Reed is... truly the deadliest. His hands moved like lightning, but Jackson had always been faster. Always. Thunder rolled across Pine Creek, not from the sky, but from the earth itself. Carson, watching through his scope, couldn't tell who drew first. The sharp reports merged into a single devastating roar. When the smoke cleared, Matthew Reed lay in the dust, 3 bullets in his chest. Jackson stood unscathed, though a bullet had creased his cheek. He knelt beside his brother as Matthew gasped his last breaths. You were right, Jackson whispered. Blood is blood. That's why this had to end. Matthew's last words came out as a gurgle. Always. The better killer. Jackson stood, wiping blood from his cheek. The battle still raged around him, but something had changed. The last threads connecting him to his old life lay dead in the dust. Time to finish this once and for all. The sun set on Pine Creek, painting the dead in shades of gold. 27 of Blackwood's men lay scattered through the streets. The rest had fled, carrying tales of the drifter's return, tales that would make hardened killers think twice about coming to this territory. Jackson stood in the ruins of his tavern, sifting through charred papers in Blackwood's saddlebags. Something's wrong, he muttered, studying a letter he'd found. Carson and Ramirez watched the street, while Hughes helped townsfolk clear debris. Wrong how? Frank asked, approaching. Blackwood was taking orders. Jackson held up the half-burned paper. Regular correspondence with someone in Denver. Someone with money and influence. How can you tell? Paper's expensive European make. And look at this seal. He pointed to a half-burned wax impression. That's real silver worked into it. Blackwood was a thug. He didn't have connections like this. Nathan Powell came running up, clutching more papers from the bank. Mr. Reed, found something in Pa's ledgers. The money Blackwood collected, it wasn't staying here. It was being moved east through a series of banks, all leading to one place. Denver, Jackson finished. He studied the young man's documents, connecting threads. Your father wasn't just recording payments. He was laundering money, making it look legitimate. Ramirez materialized from the shadows. Tracks I found last week. Supply wagons weren't just carrying guns. They were moving something else, something valuable. Gold, Frank suggested. Jackson shook his head. No. Information. He spread the papers on a burned table. Look at these. Dates, names. Blackwood wasn't building an empire. He was clearing territory, pushing out small ranches, honest businessmen, making way for something bigger. Railroads coming, Nathan said quietly. Pa mentioned it once. Said big money from the back east was buying up land, called it progress. Jackson's expression hardened. Progress is built on blood. Blackwood and his gang were just the first wave, clearing out anyone who wouldn't sell, making it look like random violence instead of organized theft. That's why they burned your tavern first, Frank realized. You were a symbol, someone who stood their ground. And now we've killed their enforcer. Jackson folded the papers carefully. Whoever's behind this, they won't let that stand. Blackwood was expendable. His death will just bring something worse. As if summoned by his words, a rider appeared at the end of the street. Everyone was tense, but the man carried a white flag. He was expensively dressed, out of place in the dusty town. "Message for Jackson Reed," he called out, holding up an envelope sealed with silver-flecked wax. Jackson's hand drifted to his Remington. "Mighty brave, coming here alone. My employer believes in civilized discourse." The messenger dismounted. Smoothly, even with uncivilized people. The implied insult rolled off Jackson like water. He took the envelope, noting the quality of the paper. Inside was a single sheet, written in elegant hand. "Mr. Reed, your interference in legitimate business matters is unfortunate. However, your reputation suggests you are a practical man. $10,000 will be deposited in any bank of your choosing in exchange for you leaving the territory permanently. Refuse, and we will be forced to take more direct action. As a demonstration of our resolve, consider this. We already have agents in place throughout the territory. One of them is watching you read this letter. You have 1 hour to decide. Regards, J.W. Jackson crumpled the letter. "Tell your employer. I don't take bribes." The messenger smiled thinly. "Then you'll send condolences for your friend Frank Tillman's tragic accident." Jackson whirled, but it was too late. The shot came from somewhere high. Frank stumbled, red blossoming on his chest. Carson's rifle roared, but the hidden shooter was already gone. As Jackson tried to stem Frank's bleeding, the messenger mounted his horse. 1 hour, Mr. Reed, don't waste it being sentimental." He rode away, leaving Jackson with the terrible knowledge that he hadn't just killed a gang leader, he'd stumbled into something far darker, a conspiracy of wealthy men who thought they could buy or bury anyone who stood in their way. They were about to learn otherwise. Frank Tillman's blood stained Jackson's hands as he worked to save his life in the church basement. Clara Wilson helped, applying pressure while Nathan ran for the doctor. Outside, Carson and Ramirez searched for the shooter, but Jackson already knew they wouldn't find him. This had been too well planned. "Damn fool," Frank coughed, his voice weak. "Should have seen it coming." "Save your strength," Jackson ordered, but Frank grabbed his wrist with surprising force. "Listen," he wheezed. "There's something you need to know about Deadwood, about why I really—" His words cut off in a fit of coughing. The basement door burst open. Marshal Ethan Calloway strode in, badge gleaming, followed by 4 deputies. "Heard about the shooting," Calloway said. "Came as soon as I could." Jackson's hand stilled on Frank's bandages. Something in the marshal's voice was off. Then he saw Frank's eyes go wide with recognition and fear. "You—" Frank gasped. Calloway's gun barked once. Frank's body jerked, then went still. Clara screamed. Jackson reached for his Remington, but Calloway's deputies already had their weapons trained on him. The marshal's face showed no emotion as he holstered his smoking gun. "Had to be done," he said calmly. "Tillman was about to tell you something inconvenient about who really hired the Malone brothers to attack that family in Deadwood, about who made sure you'd be there to stop them." The truth hit Jackson like a physical blow. "You set it up. All of it. Used me as your personal executioner," Calloway nodded. "Needed to establish your reputation. The drifter, the legendary manhunter, made tracking other targets so much easier when they were terrified of you. Why? Progress, Jackson. The railroad's coming. New money, new power, but first we need to clear the land." Blackwood was useful but crude. He smiled coldly. "You were art, the perfect weapon, until you decided to retire." Jackson's mind raced. All those bounties, all those kills, how many had been legitimate? How many had just been people who stood in the way of Calloway's progress? The letter, he said. J.W. That's Judge Wesley, isn't it? The one who always made sure my bounties were legal. Smart boy. Calloway nodded. The judge handles the legal side. I handle enforcement. Blackwood handled the muscle. Until you killed him. He gestured to his deputies. Now we're back to doing things officially. You'll never get away with this, Clara Wilson said, cradling Frank's body. No what? Calloway cut her off. That the famous drifter went crazy, started killing lawmen, sadly forced us to put him down. He sighed. Tomorrow's papers are already written, Jackson. Your legacy ends here. He paused. Unless what? Work for us. Officially this time. No more pretending you're just a manhunter. Help us clear the territory for civilization. Jackson looked at Frank's body, at Clara's terrified face, at the badge that had just murdered an unarmed man. I've got a counteroffer, he said quietly. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Oh. Jackson's voice turned to ice. I'm going to kill you. Then I'm going to kill Wesley. Then I'm going to burn your whole corrupt empire to the ground. The marshal laughed. And how exactly do you plan to do that, with 4 guns pointed at you? A knife appeared at Calloway's throat. Ramirez materialized from the shadows behind him, deadly as his namesake. Make that 2 guns pointed at her, Carson's voice carried. From the basement window, rifle aimed, 2 pointed at you. Calloway's face tightened. Kill me, the judge still wins. He's got papers, evidence. Every bounty you collected, every murder done in the name of justice. You'll hang. Maybe, Jackson agreed, drawing his Remington faster than eyes could follow. The deputies died before they could pull their triggers, but you won't be alive to see it. The basement echoed with gunfire. Marshal Calloway, the man who had twisted Jackson's legend into a tool for theft and murder, collapsed with 2 bullets in his chest. Ramirez, Jackson commanded. Get Clara somewhere safe. Carson, we need horses. Fast ones. Where are we going? Nathan asked. Jackson checked his weapons, cold purpose in every movement. Denver, time to pay Judge Wesley a visit. Show him what the drifter does to men who think they can control him. As they rode into the night, Jackson felt the weight of every kill he'd ever made. How many had been manipulated? How many innocent people had died because he trusted the wrong badge? One thing was certain. By the time he was done, the territory would understand the difference between justice and the law. And God help anyone who stood in his way. Denver loomed ahead, a city of money and power, where men like Judge Wesley thought themselves untouchable. Jackson and his hunters made camp in an abandoned mining shaft 10 miles outside town, planning what many would call suicide. Wesley's mansion sits on Capitol Hill overlooking the city, Carson reported, sketching a rough map in the dirt. 20 guards, all former military, professional killers with government credentials. Main gates are iron-plated, Hughes added, cleaning his rifle. Walls are 15 feet high with broken glass embedded on top. Man's paranoid. Not paranoid, Jackson corrected. Guilty. He spread out papers taken from Calloway's body. These detail every murder, every land grab, every corrupt deal for the past 5 years. Wesley's been building his empire on blood and bribes. Nathan Powell studied the documents, face pale. My father's name is all through these. He wasn't just recording transactions. He was helping plan them. Which is why you're staying here when we move, Jackson told him firmly. But no buts. Wesley's got eyes everywhere. You show up in Denver, word gets back to your father, then we lose our only advantage. Surprise. Carson peered through his scope toward the city. Speaking of surprise, we've got company. 6 riders approached their camp. Jackson's hand moved to his Remington, but Ramirez shook his head. Friends, he said. The ones I sent for. The riders were a rough-looking bunch. Jackson recognized some from wanted posters. Men and women who'd crossed paths with him during his manhunting days. People who owed him their lives or their freedom. Meet the other people Wesley tried to bury. Ramirez explained. A tall woman, with a burn scar across her face, dismounted first. Name's Rebecca Holloway, she said. Wesley's men burned my ranch, killed my husband. Been waiting 3 years for a chance at payback. Others introduced themselves. A former Texas Ranger fired for investigating Wesley's corruption, a Mexican rancher whose family land had been stolen through forged deeds, a young woman whose father died in jail after refusing to sell his water. Rights. We're not much, Rebecca admitted, but we're all that's left of the honest people in this territory. Word is, the drifter is finally taking the fight to Wesley. We want in. Jackson studied these desperate souls, not professional killers like his hunters, but people with nothing left to lose, people who'd lost everything to Wesley's progress. It won't be clean, he warned. Won't be legal. Rebecca's laugh was bitter as trail coffee. Legal? Law belongs to Wesley in these parts. Man's got judges, politicians, even the governor in his pocket. Only justice is what we make ourselves. Jackson nodded slowly. Ramirez, show them the plans. Carson, start teaching anyone who can shoot how to shoot better. We will move in 3 days. As his unlikely army prepared, Jackson climbed a ridge, overlooking Denver. The city glittered in the sunset, beautiful and corrupt. Somewhere in that maze of money and power, Wesley sat in his mansion, thinking himself untouchable. Quite a view, a familiar voice said behind him. Clara Wilson climbed up, her daughter wrapped tight against her chest. Should be halfway to California. By now, Jackson said, safer there. Nowhere's safe while men like Wesley rule. Clara's voice hardened. Frank Tillman died trying to warn you. Least I can do is see this through. Jackson touched the scar on his cheek, remembering his brother's last words. Wesley won't just have guards, he said. He'll have hostages, innocent people. Killing him means risking them, and letting him live means condemning how many more to death? To lose their homes, their families? Clara adjusted her sleeping child. Sometimes, mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. Jackson remembered every bounty he'd collected for Wesley, every death that had served his corrupt empire. 3 days, he said finally. Tell the others we will move in 3 days. As darkness fell over Denver, Jackson began writing letters, one to each person who'd come to fight, instructions on what to do if he fell, evidence to expose Wesley's crimes, routes to escape the territory. His own letter he kept brief. If you're reading this, I'm dead. But if you're one of Wesley's men, know this. I trained others, taught them everything I know. The next drifter will be smarter, deadlier, and they'll keep coming until your master's empire burns. Some legends never die. They just pass to those worthy of carrying them. 3 days to plan the end of Wesley's reign. 3 days to turn desperate survivors into an army. 3 days to prepare for a battle that would either cleanse the territory of corruption or add their names to its long list of victims. Jackson Reed loaded his weapons, each bullet a promise. Wesley thought he'd used his legend for his own ends. Time to show him why some legends are best left untamed. The night before the attack, an unearthly quiet settled over the rebel camp. Jackson found his hunters and allies gathered around small fires, each preparing for tomorrow in their own way. Carson methodically cleaned his rifle for the 10th time. Ramirez sharpened his knives, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a meditation. Rebecca Holloway taught others how to move in formation, using stones to demonstrate tactics. Like watching ghosts prepare for war, Clara observed, joining Jackson by the main fire. That's what we are, Jackson replied, ghosts of Wesley's victims, coming back to haunt him. They'd spent 3 days drilling, planning, and preparing. Jackson had taught them everything he could about survival and killing. Now comes the hardest part, waiting. Ramirez materialized from the darkness. Final scout report. Wesley's having a party tomorrow night. Politicians, bankers, and all his corrupt friends gather to celebrate the railroad deal. Perfect, Jackson said. All our enemies in one place. There's more. Ramirez's face tightened. He's got hostages in the cellar, families of people who opposed him. Insurance, he calls it. Jackson cursed softly. Wesley was smart, he'd give him that. Hard to attack a man when innocent lives hang in the balance. I might have a solution, Nathan said. Despite orders to stay behind, he'd refused to leave. My father's one of Wesley's guests. I could attend as his son. Get inside. Learn where the hostages are kept. Absolutely not, Jackson began, but Nathan cut him off. Frank Tillman died trying to warn you, he said firmly. I watched Blackwood's men burn down your tavern, watched them threaten Clara and her baby. I'm done hiding. Jackson studied the young man who'd once brought Clara wildflowers, seeing steel beneath the surface he'd never noticed before. You get caught, they'll kill you. Maybe. Nathan checked the revolver Jackson had taught him to use. But I'd rather die standing up than live kneeling down. A commotion at the camp's edge drew their attention. Rebecca's scouts had captured someone, a well-dressed man stumbling in the dark. Found him wandering near the perimeter, Rebecca reported. Says he has a message for you specifically. Jackson recognized him, Judge Wesley's personal secretary. The man was terrified but determined. Speak, he ordered. Judge Wesley sent me, the secretary stammered. He knows you're coming. Says to deliver a message. The hostages die first. The moment you attack, before you can reach them. There. Blood will be on your hands. Carson's rifle came up, but Jackson waved him down. That's all? He offers a deal. Leave the territory forever. Take your hunters with you. In exchange, the hostages go free. You have 1 hour to decide. Jackson's voice turned deadly quiet. Tell Wesley I remember every person he made me kill, every bounty that served his schemes. Tell him I remember their faces, their names, their last words. He stepped closer, making the secretary flinch. Tell him that tomorrow night I'm going to remind him of each one, right before I send him to meet them. The secretary fled into the darkness. Jackson turned to his gathered allies. Wesley's scared. Trying to negotiate means we've got him worried. Or he's planning something, Ramirez warned. Course he is. That's why we're changing the plan. Nathan, you'll attend that party, but not alone. Rebecca, your people know the city. Get us servants. Clothes, delivery wagons, anything that lets us slip in with the party preparations. But as sunset approached, Jackson felt a familiar tension, the calm before violence, the weight of knowing that soon people would die. A commotion at the front door drew his attention. Judge Wesley himself descended the main stairs, resplendent, in an expensive suit. He was younger than Jackson had expected, handsome in a cruel way, the kind of man who'd never gotten his own hands dirty while ordering countless deaths. Everything must be perfect, he announced to the assembled servants. Tonight we celebrate progress, the future of this territory. His eyes passed over Jackson without recognition. He forced himself to bow, bile rising in his throat. This man had used him as his personal executioner and had turned his legend into a tool for theft and murder. Now he looked right through him, seeing just another servant, almost perfect. As if sensing his thoughts, Wesley paused, something making him turn back, studying the gathered staff more carefully. For a heart-stopping moment, his gaze lingered on Jackson. Then his secretary hurried in with urgent papers, breaking the moment. Wesley turned away, never realizing death, wore a servant's dress and stood 10 feet from him. First guests arriving, sir, the secretary announced. Wesley smiled, all charm and polish. Excellent. The future awaits. Jackson slipped away, trading subtle signals with his hidden allies. Everything was in position. Soon the mansion would be filled with the territory's most corrupt power brokers, all gathered to celebrate their own triumph. None of them knew they'd walked into a trap. In the kitchen, Jackson found Clara Wilson preparing appetizers. The young mother's hands were steady as she arranged food that would soon be forgotten. Ready? Jackson asked softly. Clara nodded. The other servants know what to do when it starts. The ones with children have already left. Good, Jackson checked. The position of the sun through a window. Half hour till full dark. Tell Ramirez's people to move on the hostages the moment they hear the first shot. Jackson, Clara hesitated. If this works, if Wesley dies, what then? There'll be others like him. Jackson felt the weight of his hidden guns. Maybe, but after tonight, they'll know there's a price for hurting innocent people. Know that no amount of money can protect them from justice. The sun touched the horizon, painting the mansion's windows blood red. Carriages arrived carrying bankers, politicians, corrupt officials. Each guest received a warm welcome, never noticing how the servants marked their faces, never seeing the hunters hidden in their midst. Jackson watched Wesley greet his guests, playing the gracious host. Soon his world would shatter. Soon he'd learn why wise men feared the dark. He touched the key around his neck one last time, remembering his tavern, his attempt at a peaceful life. After tonight, there'd be no going back. The sun set, the trap was set. Time to remind them who the drifter really was. The party was in full swing when the first shot rang out. One of Wesley's guards patrolling the upper balcony collapsed without a sound. Carson's work, precise as always. Before the body hit the floor, Jackson was moving. He shed his servant's clothes in one fluid motion, Remington's appearing in his hands like magic. 2 more guards died before anyone realized what was happening. Then the screaming began. "Security breach!" someone shouted. "Protect the judge!" But Wesley's security was already compromised. Throughout the mansion, servants turned on guards with hidden weapons. Rebecca's people emerged from their disguises, cutting down Wesley's men with cold efficiency. Ghost-like, Ramirez's team was already moving toward the cellar, silent as shadows. Jackson carved through the chaos like an avenging spirit. Every shot found its mark. Every movement brought death. This wasn't the calculated violence of a manhunter. This was art, painted in gun smoke and blood. "Jackson," Nathan's voice cut through the din. "Father's trying to get Wesley to study." Jackson nodded, already moving. Around him the battle raged. The corrupt guests who'd come to celebrate their triumph now ran like rats from a sinking ship. Some tried to fight back. Bankers with hidden derringers, politicians with pocket pistols. They died just the same. 3 guards blocked the study door. Good ones, professionals. They opened fire the moment Jackson appeared. He flowed between the bullets like water, his returned fire dropping 2 before they could blink. The third managed to nick his shoulder before a knife sprouted from his throat. Ramirez, materializing from nowhere. "Hostages are almost secure," he reported. "Twice as many as we expected. Need more time." Jackson nodded. "Delay the others. I'll handle Wesley." He kicked in the study door. Judge Wesley stood behind his massive desk, Nathan's father using him as a shield. Both men held guns. "Should have taken the deal, Drifter," Wesley said, his cultured voice steady despite everything. "Could have lived a long, peaceful life somewhere else." "Peace was never an option," Jackson replied. "Not after what you made me do." "Made you?" Wesley laughed. "My dear man, I simply pointed you at targets. You did the killing, quite enthusiastically." "As I recall." "He was following the law," Powell spoke up. "We gave him legal bounties." "Lies written on official paper," Jackson cut him off. "Used me to murder innocent people who stood in your way." More gunfire erupted from the hallway. Rebecca's voice carried over the chaos. More guards coming up the back stairs. "You're surrounded," Wesley said. "My reinforcements will be here any minute, but I'm a reasonable man. Surrender now, I'll let your friends live." Jackson's laugh was cold as a desert night. "You still don't understand. There is no surrender, no deals, no walking away." His eyes locked onto Wesley's. "You're going to die tonight, Judge. Only question is how many of your friends I take with you." Wesley's composure cracked. "Powell! Kill him!" Nathan's father raised his gun and found his own son's revolver pressed against his head. "Sorry, Pa," Nathan said quietly. "Had to choose between family and right." The moment's distraction was all Jackson needed. His first shot knocked Wesley's gun away, taking 2 fingers with it. His second put a bullet through Powell's shoulder, dropping him to the floor. Wesley scrambled back, clutching his bleeding hand. "Wait, I have money, connections, I can what?" Jackson advanced, merciless as destiny. "Can you bribe me like you bribed the law? Can you threaten more innocent people?" He kicked Wesley's desk aside, sending papers flying. "Or maybe, you'll tell me how it was all for progress, for civilization." "You fool," Wesley hissed through pain. "This was never about money. Not really. It's about the future. The territory needs order, structure, and civilization." "Your kind of civilization costs too much," Jackson replied, aiming his Remington at Wesley's face. Suddenly, the mansion shook with a massive explosion from below. The floor trembled beneath their feet. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. "What did you do?" Jackson demanded. Wesley's pained grimace transformed into a smirk. "Insurance policy. The cellar. Those hostages you're so concerned about. I had the entire area rigged with enough dynamite to level half this mansion." Jackson's blood ran cold. "Ramirez, your Indian friend? If he reached the cellar, well, pity about that. But don't worry, I have more surprises." As if on cue, a second explosion rocked the mansion, this one closer, more violent. Part of the ceiling collapsed in the corner of the study. "You're insane," Nathan whispered, stunned by the destruction his father's partner had unleashed. "I'm a visionary," Wesley shouted above the growing roar of flames. "You think killing me ends anything? The governor himself is my partner. Senators in Washington back our endeavors. This territory will be civilized whether vermin like you want it or not." Jackson kept his gun trained on Wesley, but moved toward the window. Outside, he could see fresh chaos erupting. Men in military uniforms, not just guards but professional soldiers, poured into the grounds from hidden entrances. "Colorado. National Guard," Wesley explained, his confidence returning despite his injury. "Officially responding to a terrorist attack on a respected judge. By morning, you'll be the villain in every newspaper from here to St. Louis." Through the broken window, Jackson heard Clara's scream from somewhere in the courtyard. His jaw tightened as he faced a choice. Finish Wesley or save his people. "Go ahead," Wesley taunted. "Pull the trigger. It won't save your friends. It won't undo what you did for me all those years. The only smart play is to run while you still can." "Nathan," Jackson said, without taking his eyes off Wesley, "get your father out of here. Find Carson. Tell him to cover the eastern approach. What about you? I'll be right behind you." When they were gone, Jackson stepped closer to Wesley, who remained defiant despite his wounds. "You won't kill me," the judge said. "You need me alive to clear your name." "I don't care about my name." Jackson's voice was deadly calm. "But you're right, I'm not going to kill you." Relief flooded Wesley's face, quickly replaced by confusion, as Jackson holstered one Remington and pulled out a length of cord. "What are you doing?" "Making sure you face justice," Jackson said, binding Wesley's hands. "The real kind, with evidence, witnesses, and a proper trial. The kind you denied so many others." "You're a fool!" Wesley struggled as Jackson dragged him toward the door. "They'll never convict me. I own half the judges in the territory." "Maybe," Jackson conceded, "but after tonight, every newspaper will be printing those documents we found. Every crooked deal, every murder, every theft. The people will know what kind of progress you've been selling." A third explosion shook the mansion as Jackson forced Wesley down the hall. The grand staircase was engulfed in flames, cutting off their escape route. "We'll burn!" Wesley shouted. "Let me go!" "There's another way." Jackson pushed him toward a servant's stairwell at the back of the mansion. They descended into growing chaos. The once elegant mansion was transforming into an inferno. Through smoke and flame, Jackson caught glimpses of running figures, some of his allies, others Wesley's men, engaged in desperate combat throughout the burning structure. Outside, the night was split by gunfire and shouting. Carson's rifle spoke, methodically from some distant perch, dropping National Guardsmen one by one as they tried to encircle the mansion. "Jackson!" Rebecca appeared through the smoke, bleeding from a gash on her forehead. The cellar collapsed. Ramirez and 3 others are still unaccounted for. Clara's gathering survivors at the rendezvous point. The hostages? Most got out before the explosion. At least 15. Some are injured. Jackson pushed Wesley forward. "Get him to Clara. Make sure he stays alive to stand trial." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You're not coming?" "Still have people inside." Before she could argue, Jackson plunged back into the burning mansion. The heat was becoming unbearable, smoke filling every corridor. He pulled a damp cloth from his pocket, covering his mouth as he pressed deeper into the inferno. He found Hughes first, pinned under a fallen beam, still alive but badly burned. "Leave me," the former hangman coughed as Jackson tried to lift the beam. "Too heavy, get the others." "No man left behind," Jackson grunted, straining against the crushing weight. The beam wouldn't budge. Hughes reached inside his coat, producing a stick of dynamite and a match. "Always prepared," he wheezed with a grim smile. "Get clear. I'll make myself useful one last time." Jackson hesitated, then clasped his friend's hand. "It was an honor." "Likewise," Hughes replied. "Now go, and Jackson, make it count." Jackson retreated around a corner as Hughes struck the match. The explosion blasted a hole through the floor, taking the hangman with it, but creating a path to the cellar below. Through swirling dust and debris, Jackson spotted movement in the ruins of the cellar. Ramirez lay half-buried in rubble, still breathing. Beside him, huddled against a partially collapsed wall, were 3 children, hostages who hadn't made it out before the explosion. "Knew you'd come," Ramirez coughed as Jackson began clearing debris from his trapped legs. "Always were stubborn. Save your breath." Jackson freed him, then scooped up the smallest child. "Can you walk?" Ramirez nodded, staggering to his feet. "Take them. I'll follow." The mansion was fully engulfed now, support beams groaning as the structure began to collapse. Around them, Jackson led the way, carrying one child, while Ramirez helped the other 2 navigate the treacherous path through flame and falling debris. They had almost reached the kitchen door when a final explosion ripped through the mansion's foundation. The ceiling above them gave way with a thunderous crack. "Run!" Jackson shouted, pushing the children forward as tons of burning timber descended. They burst through the door into the cool night air, just as the entire eastern wing of the mansion collapsed in a roar of flame and destruction. The force of the blast threw them across the courtyard. Jackson rolled to his feet, counting heads. All 3 children were clear, scraped and terrified but alive. Ramirez lay a few feet away, not moving. "Ghost!" Jackson rushed to his side. The tracker's eyes fluttered open. "Did we get them all?" "We got the children. Rest easy." Ramirez gripped Jackson's arm with surprising strength. "Wesley?" "Alive." "Rebecca's taking him to stand trial." The tracker nodded, satisfied. "Good. Justice, not vengeance." His eyes drifted past Jackson, widening. "Behind you!" Jackson spun, drawing his Remington in one fluid motion. A National Guardsman stood 20 paces away, rifle raised. Both men fired simultaneously. The guardsman crumpled, Jackson's bullet finding his heart. But Jackson felt a hammer blow to his chest that knocked him backwards. He looked down to see crimson spreading across his shirt. "Bad?" Ramirez asked, trying to prop himself up. "I've had worse," Jackson lied, pressing his hand against the wound. The bullet had struck high in his chest, close to the shoulder, not immediately fatal, but serious enough. More guardsmen were approaching, drawn by the gunfire. Jackson helped Ramirez to his feet and together they limped toward the cover of a stone garden wall, shepherding the children ahead of them. "Won't make the rendezvous point," Ramirez gasped. "Not like this." "Don't need to." Jackson pointed to approaching riders. Rebecca's. "People coming back for them. Just need to hold out a little longer." They reached the wall just as rifle fire erupted behind them. Jackson pushed the children down behind the stonework, then turned and emptied his Remingtons at their pursuers. 3 more guardsmen fell, but others took cover and continued firing. Jackson reloaded mechanically, his movements slowing as blood loss began to take its toll. The bullet in his chest made each breath a struggle. "Just like Deadwood," Ramirez observed, firing his own weapon. "Despite his injuries." "Different," Jackson corrected. "Deadwood was about death. This is about something worth living for." The approaching riders were close now, laying down covering fire as they galloped toward the garden wall. Jackson recognized Clara Wilson leading them, her face set with determination as she charged directly into danger. "Remarkable woman," Ramirez commented. "She is that!" A bullet struck the wall inches from Jackson's head, showering him with stone fragments. He ducked, then rose to return fire, but his vision swam. The Remington felt impossibly heavy in his hand. "Jackson!" Clara's voice cut through the gunfire as she reached the wall, leaping from her horse. "We need to go, now!" She took in his blood-soaked shirt with a single glance, her expression hardening. "Can you ride?" "Get the children and Ramirez out first." "Not leaving you," she snapped, helping a child onto her horse. The other riders had reached them now, creating a defensive perimeter as they prepared for retreat. The National Guard was regrouping, more men joining their ranks by the minute. "Take the South Trail," Jackson told Clara. "Carson will cover you from the ridge." "And you?" He checked his weapons, calculating odds, making peace with what needed to be done. "Someone has to hold them here, buy you time." Clara's eyes flashed with anger. "No, that's not acceptable." "Not your choice," he replied gently. "Wesley has to face justice. The evidence has to reach Denver. Those children need to get home." "We need you," she insisted. Jackson forced a smile, despite the pain radiating through his chest. "You've never needed me, Clara. You're stronger than you know." A fresh volley of gunfire peppered their position. Their time was running out. "Go," Jackson urged. "I'll be right behind you." The lie hung between them, neither believing it. "Jackson Reed," Clara said firmly, "if you die here, I will never forgive you." She grabbed his collar and kissed him fiercely, then mounted her horse. "We'll wait for you at Thunder Canyon. 1 hour." As she galloped away with the others, Jackson turned to face the approaching guardsman. He reloaded his Remingtons one last time, the familiar ritual bringing a strange calm, despite the dire circumstances. The mansion burned behind him, a funeral pyre for Judge Wesley's corrupt empire. Ahead, at least 20 armed men advanced cautiously toward his position. Poor odds, but he'd faced worse. Jackson took a deep breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in his chest. Then he stepped out from behind the wall, Remingtons raised, ready to give his friends the time they needed to escape. "Come on, then," he whispered to himself. "Let's see if the legend dies tonight." The first volley of gunfire tore through the night, bullets kicking up dirt around Jackson's boots. He dove behind a stone fountain, returning fire with mechanical precision. 2 guardsmen fell immediately, the others scattering for cover. Blood soaked his shirt, each heartbeat pumping more of his life onto the manicured grounds of Wesley's burning estate. The bullet in his chest made every breath a struggle, but his hands remained steady. The drifter had been born in pain. He would not die flinching from it. Through the flames and gunsmoke, Jackson counted 15 men advancing on his position, professionals using proper military tactics. Not the usual thugs he'd faced throughout his life. These men had training, discipline, and superior numbers. Jackson reloaded behind the meager cover of the fountain. 6 bullets, 15 men. Bad math even for him. "Surrender, Reed!" A commanding voice called out. "You're surrounded. There's no escape." Jackson recognized the voice. Captain Ellis Palmer, decorated veteran of the frontier campaigns. He'd encountered the man years ago when tracking a bounty through military territory. "That you, Palmer?" Jackson called back. "Surprised to find you playing attack dog for corrupt judges these days?" A pause. "Reed, the bounty hunter. Former. What the hell are you doing here?" "My orders say you're leading terrorists against a government official." Jackson laughed, the sound turning into a wet cough. "Might want to check your sources, Captain. That government official is neck-deep in land theft, murder, and corruption. I've got the documents to prove it." Another silence, longer this time. Jackson used the moment to assess his situation. The pain in his chest was growing worse, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. He wouldn't last much longer without medical attention. Behind him, the conflagration that had been Wesley's mansion illuminated the night sky, casting long shadows across the grounds. His friends would be well away by now, following the south. Trail to Thunder Canyon. If he could create enough chaos here, they'd make it clean away. "I'm coming out to talk," Palmer announced. "Hold your fire." Jackson squinted through the smoke. "No tricks, Captain. I've still got 12 shots and I don't miss." A figure emerged from behind a hedge, hands raised. Palmer approached slowly, rifle slung across his back. "You're wounded?" he observed, stopping 10 paces away. "Had worse," Jackson lied. Palmer's eyes narrowed. "Those documents you mentioned, what exactly do they prove?" "Everything. Land grabs disguised as legal purchases, bribes to officials, orders for murders signed in Wesley's own hand. The names of every person in his pocket, from sheriffs to senators." Jackson pressed his hand tighter against his wound. "Including orders to your National Guard to cover up his operations." Palmer's jaw tightened. "Serious accusations." "Truth. Usually is." The captain studied him carefully. "My orders came directly from the governor's office. Said you and your gang were attacking a respected judge, threatening the rule of law. Ask yourself this," Jackson said, his voice growing weaker. "Why would a judge need 20 armed guards? Why would he keep hostages in his cellar? Why would he blow up his own mansion rather than face justice?" Palmer looked back at the burning building, then to the men waiting for his orders. Jackson could see the conflict in his face, a soldier confronting the possibility he'd been used for corrupt purposes. "Where are these documents now?" Palmer asked finally. "Safe, beyond your reach." Jackson shifted position, wincing at the stab of pain. "But I'll make you a deal. Let me ride out of here and copies find their way to every newspaper in the territory. Try to stop me, they go to Washington instead. Directly to the Attorney General. It was a bluff. The documents were with Clara, heading for Denver to be published as soon as possible. But Palmer didn't know that. The captain was silent for a long moment, wrestling with his decision. Finally, he nodded. 1 hour head start. Then we come after you, all of us. That's the best I can do." "Fair enough," Jackson said, knowing he wouldn't last half that time in his current condition. Palmer turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Reed, I always heard you were a man who lived by a code, never killed without cause." His eyes met Jackson's. "I hope I'm not making a mistake." "You're not," Jackson assured him. "But when those documents go public, you'll want to be on the right side of what comes after." The captain nodded once more, then walked back to his men. Jackson heard terse orders being issued. "Stand down, secure the perimeter, tend the wounded." He waited until Palmer's back was turned, then slipped away into the darkness. His horse waited where he'd left it, tethered in a grove of trees beyond the garden wall. Every movement sent fresh agony through his chest, but he managed to pull himself into the saddle. As he rode away from the burning mansion, Jackson knew he was leaving a blood trail any decent tracker could follow. He wouldn't make it to Thunder Canyon, not in his condition. But he could draw any potential pursuit away from his friend's escape route. He turned east instead of south, pushing his horse as hard as he dared. The plains stretched before him, silver black under the moon. Behind him, Denver's lights receded, and with them, the immediate danger to Clara and the others. After an hour of hard riding, Jackson felt himself weakening. The blood loss was taking its toll. His vision swam, the horizon tilting at impossible angles. Only years of experience kept him in the saddle. He spotted a small creek cutting through the plains ahead, lined with cottonwoods. A defensible position, if it came to that, and water, which he desperately needed. Jackson dismounted clumsily, nearly collapsing as his boots hit the ground. He led his horse to drink, then knelt beside the creek, splashing cold water on his face. The shock of it brought momentary clarity. He examined his wound by moonlight. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone, missing his heart, but likely puncturing a lung. No exit wound, which meant the lead was still inside him. Bad, but not immediately fatal, unless infection sets in. Using his knife, Jackson cut strips from his shirt to fashion a crude bandage. He packed the wound as best he could, stemming the bleeding temporarily. Then he forced himself to drink, knowing dehydration would kill him faster than the bullet. His strength fading, Jackson settled himself against a cottonwood trunk, Remington's across his lap. If Palmer changed his mind, if pursuit came, he would make his final stand here, buy a little more time for the others. The night was quiet, except for the gentle burble of the creek and the occasional cry of a coyote. Jackson found his thoughts drifting to strange places, to his childhood in Missouri, to his brother Matthew's first lessons in gunplay, to the faces of men he'd killed, and to newer memories, the warmth of his tavern on a winter evening, Frank Tillman's quiet companionship, Clara Wilson's fierce determination, her lips pressed against his in what they both knew might be a final goodbye. He must have dozed, for he woke with a start to find dawn breaking over the eastern plains. His bandages were soaked through, his body fever-hot despite the morning chill. Infection setting in already. Jackson checked his guns by reflex, then scanned the horizon. No sign of pursuit. Perhaps Palmer had kept his word after all. His horse nickered softly from where it grazed nearby. With tremendous effort, Jackson pulled himself to his feet. He had to keep moving, had to get further from Denver, draw any potential trackers away from Thunder Canyon. Somehow, he managed to mount up again. Each movement was agony now, his body protesting every command. But the drifter had always been stubborn. Death would have to work harder than this to claim him. He rode east with the rising sun at his back, following the creek. The landscape blurred around him as fever took stronger hold. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours, he couldn't tell which passed as he clung to the saddle. Around midday, Jackson spotted a small cabin nestled against a stand of pines in the distance. Smoke rose from its chimney, a sign of habitation. Veered toward it, knowing he couldn't continue much longer without help. As he approached, a figure emerged from the cabin, an older man with a long white beard, rifle cradled in his arms. The homesteader watched warily as Jackson drew closer. "That's far enough, stranger," the man called when Jackson was within earshot. "State your business." Jackson swayed in the saddle. "Need help." "Shot." The man squinted at him, taking in the blood-soaked bandages. "Are you running from the law?" "Depends on your definition of law," Jackson managed, fighting to stay conscious. The homesteader's weathered face cracked in a sudden grin. "Good answer. Been out here 40 years, and the law ain't never done me no favors." He lowered his rifle. "Come on then. Let's get you inside before you fall off that horse and make more work for me." Jackson remembered little of the next few days. Fever dreams took him, nightmares of Deadwood, of his brother's death, of Wesley's burning mansion. Sometimes he thought he heard voices arguing nearby, felt hands changing his bandages, tasted bitter herbal concoctions forced between his lips. Once, he was certain he saw Clara Wilson sitting beside his bed, her cool hand on his brow. But that had to be the fever playing tricks. She was miles away, safe in Thunder Canyon with the others. On the fourth day, Jackson woke clear-headed for the first time. He lay on a narrow cot in a small, neat cabin. Afternoon sunlight streamed through a single window. His chest was tightly bandaged, the pain reduced to a dull throbbing. Welcome back to the land of the living. Jackson turned his head to see the bearded homesteader sitting in a rocking chair nearby, whittling a piece of wood. "How long?" Jackson's voice was a rasp. 4 days. Thought we'd lose you on the second. That bullet did a fair bit of damage before. I dug it out. The old man set aside his carving. Name's Elijah Winters, by the way, former surgeon with the 7th Cavalry, current hermit, and occasional healer of fools with bullet holes. Jackson Reed. I'm obliged to you. Oh, I know who you are, Drifter. Elijah's eyes twinkled. Your reputation precedes you, but don't worry. I've got no love for the law nor those who twist it. Jackson tried to sit up, grimacing at the effort. Need to get word to my friends. They'll think I'm dead. Already taken care of, Elijah assured him. The lady with the little girl found you on the second day. Quite a tracker, that one. She's been by every day since, when you were too fevered to notice. Clara, she's supposed to be in Thunder Canyon, said. Something about not leaving you behind, stubborn woman. The old surgeon passed Jackson a cup of water. She brought interesting news from Denver. Seems Judge Wesley and some banker named Powell are facing federal charges. Military police arrested the governor yesterday. Something about corruption and land fraud. Despite his weakness, Jackson felt a smile tug at his lips. The documents made it through, caused quite the stir, from what I hear. Half the territorial officials are either arrested or on the run. The other half are falling over themselves to prove their innocence. Elijah rocked back in his chair. Palmer's been by too. Palmer? Jackson tensed. Captain of the guard. Wanted. To make sure you were alive to testify. Seems he's had suspicions about Wesley for months, but lacked proof. Your documents gave him what he needed to act. The old man's eyes were shrewd. You've kicked over quite the hornet's nest, son. Not my intention, Jackson admitted. Just wanted to set things right. Well, intentional or not, things are changing fast. U.S. Marshals have taken over law enforcement across half the territory while they sort out who's corrupt and who's honest. Elijah handed him a newspaper. You made the front page. Jackson glanced at the headline. Corruption Empire Falls. Legendary manhunter exposes judge's criminal network. Below was an artist's rendition of him, more myth than man, looking far more heroic than he'd ever felt. They've got it wrong, he murmured. Wasn't just me. Had help. History's written by survivors, Elijah shrugged. And newspaperman God. Help us all. A knock at the door interrupted them. Elijah rose to answer it, admitting Clara Wilson, her daughter in tow. You're awake, she said, relief washing over her face as she saw Jackson sitting up. Apparently, he answered, finding himself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Elijah tactfully took the child outside to see the chickens, leaving them alone. Clara approached the bed, her expression a complex mixture of anger, relief, and something softer Jackson couldn't quite name. You were supposed to follow us, she accused, not play hero and nearly bleed to death. Old habits, he offered weakly, bad ones. She sat on the edge of the bed. Everyone's safe. The hostages have been reunited with their families. Ramirez is recovering at Rebecca's ranch. Carson's helping. The federal marshals tracked down Wesley's remaining associates. She paused. We did it, Jackson. We actually did it. Wesley? Singing like a canary to save his own skin, implicating everyone from local sheriffs to U.S. senators. They've placed him under federal protection. Too many people want him dead. Jackson nodded, relief washing through him. It was over, finally over. What happens now? Clara asked after a moment of silence. Hadn't thought that far ahead, Jackson admitted. Never expected to survive this. She took his hand, her grip firm and warm. Well, You did survive, so perhaps it's time to consider a future beyond the next gunfight. I'm not sure I know how. He said honestly, I might have some ideas. Clara's smile held a challenge. Pine Creek needs rebuilding. The Whispering Pine was the heart of the town. We could use a new one. You want me to go back to being a tavern keeper? I want you to come home, she said simply. The rest we can figure out together. Home. The word stirred something in Jackson he'd thought long dead. After years of drifting, of hunting, of violence and retribution, the idea of belonging somewhere again seemed almost foreign. And yet, it won't be easy, he warned. The drifters made a lot of enemies. Some will come looking. Let them come, Clara replied with the quiet confidence that had first drawn him to her. We'll be ready. Jackson looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the widow who'd sought his protection, but a woman of uncommon courage and determination. Someone who had fought alongside him against impossible odds and emerged victorious. Someone worth building a future with. Might need a few weeks to heal first, he said. This old surgeon seems to think getting shot is a serious matter. Her laugh was like the sunrise after the longest night. Take your time, Jackson Reed. We'll be waiting when you're ready. 3 months later, a new tavern opened in Pine Creek, built of stone rather than wood, with large windows and a wide porch. It stood as a testament to a town reborn from corruption's ashes. They called it the Drifter's Rest. Its owner was a quiet man who kept to himself mostly, though he was fair in his dealings and generous to those in need. Some said he'd once been a famous manhunter, that he could outdraw lightning itself, that he'd single-handedly brought down the most corrupt officials in the territory's history. Others claimed these were just tall tales, the kind that sprung up in frontier towns like mushrooms after rain. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. What everyone agreed on was that trouble steered clear of Pine Creek these days, perhaps because the town had learned to stand together against threats, perhaps because of the way law and justice had finally aligned, or perhaps, as some whispered late at night over whiskey, because certain men still remembered the legend of the Drifter and knew that some legends never truly retire. They just went a different way to serve justice. Sometimes, travelers passing through would notice a weathered carved feather embedded in the new tavern's bar top. If they were foolish enough to ask about it, they'd receive only cryptic smiles in response, and if they looked carefully, they might spot the tavern keeper's hand drift briefly to his side when strangers entered, an old habit, hard to break. They might notice how his eyes constantly scanned the room, missing nothing, how the townsfolk treated him with a curious mixture of respect and awe. But mostly, they'd notice how he smiled when a dark-haired woman with a young daughter brought him coffee in the mornings, how his weathered face softened when the child showed him her latest drawing, how, for a man rumored to have been a dealer of death, he seemed remarkably at peace with life, because some journeys end where they began, with a man behind a bar, serving drinks instead of justice, finding in simple daily acts the redemption that had eluded him on the trail. And if, occasionally, he disappeared for a week or two, returning with fresh scars and tired eyes, well, old habits die hard. Justice still needed serving in dark corners of the territory. But he always came back, always returned to the home and family he'd found, for the Drifter had finally stopped drifting, and Jackson Reed had finally found peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.